Boston's autumn is brief. By the time the beautiful fall foliage adorns the city, you can already feel winter approaching. Margaret Hamilton gazed out at the cityscape from her real estate office window, harboring complex feelings about growing another year older. An indescribable sense of restlessness swirled within her heart. 7 years had passed since her marriage. She had met her husband David in college, drawn to his calm and intellectual demeanor as he worked at an IT company. He had seemed like the ideal partner for Margaret. In the early days of their marriage, they would talk about the future and dream of someday building a warm home surrounded by children. However, as time went on, that dream gradually faded into the distance. They had begun fertility treatments 3 years ago. At first, she had visited the hospital with a light heart, but as the tests accumulated, the seriousness of the situation became clear. The doctor's explanations were filled with medical terminology, and Margaret was stunned by how much she didn't know about her own body. Hormone injections, ovulation stimulants, timing methods. Each month, when her period came, hope and despair alternated in cycles. David's reaction was different from what she had expected. He was reluctant about the treatments, repeatedly saying, "Let's leave it to nature." Every time Margaret made a hospital appointment, a faint look of confusion would cross his face. He began frequently missing the counseling sessions they were supposed to attend together, using work as an excuse. Margaret found herself increasingly listening to doctors' explanations alone and making decisions about the next steps by herself. The pressure from her parents was also growing stronger day by day. Her father Robert openly declared that seeing his grandchild's face would be his greatest joy. Her mother Carol made no attempt to hide her feelings of being left behind while her friends showed off photos of their grandchildren. "Margaret, you're already 35 years old. Time won't wait," Carol said without reservation at a Sunday family gathering. "Emily is still young and has time, but you need to hurry." Her younger sister Emily worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She appeared to be enjoying her single life, wasn't very aggressive about romance, and often laughed when she answered, "I'm too busy with work to have time to find a boyfriend." Margaret sometimes envied her sister. Emily didn't have the pressure to have children and seemed to be walking through life at her own pace. However, recently Margaret had begun to sense subtle changes occurring within the family. Her parents had become less likely to ask her, "When will we have grandchildren?" as they used to. Instead, their interest in Emily seemed to be growing. Her mother frequently inquired about Emily's recent activities, and her father had also begun praising her sister's work performance more often. While organizing real estate contracts, Margaret wondered where her life had taken a wrong turn. Her work was going well, and she had strong trust from her clients. She was financially stable too. However, deep in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't just because she didn't have children, it was a deeper sense of loneliness. Her relationship with her husband also maintained surface-level peace, but she couldn't deny that their deep connection was fading. David was still kind and a good husband who shared the housework. However, when Margaret needed him most, he seemed to maintain psychological distance. When she tried to discuss fertility treatments, he would want to change the subject and began avoiding talking about future plans. Margaret gazed out the window, questioning how long this situation would continue. Should she continue with the treatments, or should she explore a different path? Time passed without finding answers. Toward the end of October, David began coming home later. Until then, he had been someone who maintained a regular lifestyle, always returning home by 6 o'clock. Suddenly, he began saying, "The project has gotten busy," and started coming home after 9 o'clock 2 or 3 times a week. At first, Margaret thought it was natural considering the fierce competition in the IT industry. Her husband's company was a medium-sized software development firm, and overtime was probably unavoidable to survive competition with larger companies. However, there were other changes in David's behavior. While he used to complain about work and talk about colleagues, recently he had begun speaking less in detail about work. When she asked questions, he increasingly gave vague answers like, "It's complicated system stuff." Problems also began arising with fertility treatment appointments. Margaret visited the specialized clinic twice a month, but the doctor emphasized the importance of consultations with both spouses present. However, David increasingly failed to accompany her to scheduled appointments, citing reasons like, "I have a meeting I absolutely can't get out of," or "the client meeting ran long." Margaret sat alone in the waiting room, watching other couples hold hands as they entered the examination room, experiencing an indescribable sense of loneliness. In November, changes also appeared in Emily's behavior. She, who had previously visited their parents' house only about once a month, began showing up twice a week. When Margaret visited her parents' house on Sundays, Emily was often already there. Moreover, she was clearly in better spirits than before, chatting happily with Carol. "Emily has been showing her face quite often lately," Carol explained to Margaret. "She seems tired from work stress, so she comes to eat Mom's home cooking." However, to Margaret's eyes, Emily didn't appear tired. Rather, she seemed more lively than before, wearing an expression as if she were harboring some secret. When her sister talked about her work at the hospital, she became more talkative than usual, especially speaking in detail about her experiences in obstetrics and gynecology. "Lately, I've been attending many births," Emily said with sparkling eyes. "The moment when new life is born is truly mystical. When I see the whole family crying tears of joy, I feel happy too." As Margaret listened to this story, she felt a sharp pain deep in her chest. She knew her sister's words weren't malicious, but it was a painful topic for someone suffering through fertility treatments. However, whether Emily was aware of Margaret's feelings or not, she continued talking about childbirth. There were also subtle changes in her parents' attitudes. Her father Robert, who had previously put direct pressure on her asking, "When will we have grandchildren?" had recently begun avoiding that topic. Instead, he had begun talking more about Emily's future. "Emily should also find a good man soon and start a family," Robert said with deep emotion. "She has a respectable profession as a nurse, and she'll surely make a good mother." Carol also intensified her interest in Emily. While she used to inquire worriedly about Margaret's fertility treatments, recently she had begun touching on that topic less frequently. Instead, she had begun paying detailed attention to Emily's health and diet. "Emily, are you eating nutritious food properly?" Carol said to her daughter. "Nursing work uses physical strength. You especially need to take enough folic acid and calcium." Margaret felt something odd about her mother's words. Folic acid was known as a nutrient that pregnant women and women hoping to become pregnant should actively consume. Why was her mother talking to Emily about folic acid? In December, David's behavior became even more puzzling. He began carrying his cell phone with him at all times, and when messages came, he increasingly moved to another room to reply. The details of his schedule had also disappeared from the calendar app they used to share as a couple. "Next Tuesday, I have a clinic appointment. Can you come with me?" Margaret asked, and David thought for a moment before answering. "Sorry, I might have a business trip that day. I might have to go to the New York branch office." However, when she checked the following week, David hadn't gone on a business trip. When Margaret coincidentally met a colleague from his company and asked, the answer came back, "David. He was in the office as usual last week." Margaret considered confronting her husband, but convinced herself that there might be some important reason. In married life, having some secrets wasn't unusual. However, deep in her heart, anxiety was sprouting that some major change might be occurring. Emily's changes also continued. She began talking about her physical condition more frequently than before. "Lately, it's been hard to get up in the morning. I seem to have become sensitive to smells. I feel like my food preferences have changed." These statements from her sister, who was a nurse, held special meaning for Margaret. Through continuing fertility treatments, she had learned in detail about early pregnancy symptoms. However, Emily was single, and she had never heard of her having a boyfriend. Margaret tried to dismiss her suspicions, but every time she looked at her sister, those suspicions grew stronger. As Christmas approached, changes also appeared in conversations at family gatherings. Her parents, who had previously spoken optimistically about future plans, suddenly began bringing up realistic topics. "Margaret, what are you two thinking about children?" Robert asked directly. "Considering age, it might be time to think about other options." "Other options?" Margaret was puzzled. "Adoption, things like that," Carol explained. Recently, there are various forms of families, aren't there? Blood relationships aren't everything. Margaret was surprised by her parents' sudden statements. Why had her parents, who had previously strongly desired a blood-related grandchild, suddenly begun talking about adoption? During that conversation, Emily listened silently but occasionally showed meaningful expressions. As the year-end approached, Margaret felt bewildered by the changes in her surrounding environment. Her husband's behavior, her sister's condition, her parents' attitudes. Everything was changing little by little, but certainly. She was certain something was happening, but she didn't know what it was. It felt as if she alone was being left outside the circle. The March morning was calm. Spring's presence was finally beginning to drift into Boston, and warmth could be felt in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Margaret was in the kitchen making coffee and preparing breakfast as usual. David had already left for work, and in the house wrapped in silence, only the sound of the coffee maker echoed. Margaret took her mug and settled onto the living room sofa. As one of her morning routines, she had developed the habit of checking social media on her smartphone. She opened the Facebook app and began browsing her friends' recent updates. News of a college classmate's promotion, photos of flowers blooming in a neighbor's garden, a colleague's weekend family trip. Ordinary, warm fragments of daily life flowed across the screen. While enjoying the coffee's aroma, Margaret casually continued scrolling. Then, the moment that post came into view, she felt as if time had stopped. It was Emily's post. The photo showed Emily sitting on a hospital bed. In her arms was a small baby wrapped in a white blanket. Emily's face showed an expression mixing fatigue and happiness, filled with a mother's radiance. Standing on either side of the photo were Robert and Carol. Both wore broad smiles, expressions as if they were experiencing the greatest moment of their lives. Margaret gasped. Her sister had given birth. But when had Emily become pregnant? She hadn't heard about her getting married. She didn't even know she had a boyfriend. With trembling hands, she read the caption. A new member has been welcomed to our family. With everyone's support, we were able to safely welcome a healthy baby. From now on, as a mother, I will do my best. I would be happy if you could watch over us warmly. Margaret looked more closely at the photo, enlarging the screen. At that moment, something in the background caught her eye, and her heart began beating violently. On the small table in the hospital room lay a familiar set of car keys. It was unmistakably David's keys. The black BMW key with the custom-made keychain that Margaret had given him for his birthday. A small silver plate engraved with his initials D.H, and a heart-shaped charm with their anniversary date carved into it. It was a special, one-of-a-kind keychain. Margaret's mug nearly slipped from her hands. Seeing the coffee surface trembling slightly, she realized her hands were shaking. Why were David's keys at her sister's birth scene? Possibilities she didn't want to consider raced through her mind. Her sister's frequent visits home, the changes in her physical condition, the changes in her parents' attitudes, and David's suspicious behavior. All the pieces were beginning to form a terrible puzzle. Margaret took a screenshot of the photo. She needed to keep it as evidence. Then she began reading the comments on the post. Many congratulatory messages from friends and relatives had been posted. Margaret stood up and paced around the living room. She couldn't accept reality. Did this mean her husband had been having an affair with her sister? And her sister had given birth to her husband's child? Did her parents know about this? Thinking back, all the mysteries were being solved. David's frequent overtime and fake business trips. Emily's frequent visits home and physical changes resembling early pregnancy symptoms. The changes in her parents' attitudes and their sudden mention of adoption. David's failure to accompany her to fertility treatment appointments. Margaret sank into a chair and held her head in her hands. 7 years of married life, 3 years of fertility treatment suffering, pressure from family. Had it all been a lie? While she suffered from being unable to have children, had her husband been having a relationship with her sister become pregnant with her husband's child, and given birth? However, rather than anger, calmness returned to Margaret first. The cool judgment she had cultivated in the real estate industry supported her in the storm of emotions. First, she needed to verify the facts, gather evidence, and then take appropriate action. Margaret picked up her smartphone again and began analyzing Emily's post in detail. The expressions of the people in the photo, the hospital room scene, and above all, that keychain. She saved everything as screenshots and recorded the date and time. Next, she recalled David's behavior over the past few months and wrote it down in notes. The frequency of overtime, fake business trips, changes in how he used his cell phone, his reluctant attitude toward fertility treatments. Everything had been part of one big deception. Margaret took a deep breath and decided to leave a comment on the post. She needed to show her position calmly but clearly, without becoming emotional. She placed her fingers on the keyboard and carefully chose her words. "Congratulations on your birth. I pray for your healthy days ahead." It was a short comment, but Margaret put complex feelings into those words. On the surface, it was a congratulatory message, but at the same time, it hinted that she knew everything. The words, "I pray for your healthy days ahead," also carried an ironic tone. After posting the comment, Margaret stood up again. Now it was time to take action. She needed to contact a lawyer and consult about divorce procedures. She also had to gather evidence of the affair and consider claiming compensation. However, there was one more thing she needed to do before that. When David came home, she needed to act normally. Without making the other party suspicious, she had to secure time to gather more evidence. Margaret returned to the kitchen and wiped up the spilled coffee. Then she began preparing dinner as usual. While pretending nothing had changed in her daily routine, she inwardly began plotting revenge. In the afternoon, Margaret received a message on her cell phone. It was from Carol. "Emily gave birth. It's a healthy baby. Let's all go visit her together sometime." Margaret calmly wrote back, "That's wonderful news. I'll consider the visit." That afternoon, Margaret researched reliable divorce attorneys and made an appointment for the next day. She also gathered information about private investigators. To get more solid evidence of the affair, she needed professional help. In the evening, David came home. He called out, "Good work today," as usual, and kissed Margaret's cheek. At that moment, Margaret felt disgusted, but she didn't show it. "How was your day?" David asked. "Normal. How about you?" Margaret answered, feigning composure. "Busy, but not too bad," David answered vaguely. That night, Margaret continued to act normally during dinner. While observing David's behavior, inwardly her feelings of hatred and contempt for him were growing. However, she continued to wear the mask of the perfect wife. Before going to bed, Margaret checked Emily's Facebook post again. The number of comments had increased, with many people sending congratulatory messages. Among them, she also found comments from David's colleagues. It was a short message saying congratulations, but it suggested that their relationship was known at the workplace too. Margaret continued organizing evidence. Tomorrow she would begin a full-scale investigation and plan retaliation for this betrayal. Her 7-year marriage was about to end, but Margaret had no intention of crying herself to sleep as a victim. That night, Margaret made dinner as usual. She prepared David's favorite roast beef as the main dish, accompanied by mashed potatoes and green beans that he always praised. She lit candles and prepared wine too. She set the table as if celebrating a special anniversary. At 7:30, David came home. When she heard his footsteps at the entrance, Margaret's heart was cold as ice. However, her expression wore a smile. "Welcome home," Margaret went to greet him at the entrance. "I'm back. I was able to come home early today," David kissed her cheek as usual. At that moment, Margaret felt goosebumps all over her body, but she didn't let her smile falter. "I made a lovely dinner. Let's spend a quiet evening together tonight." David showed a surprised expression. "Was it some special day?" "I haven't forgotten an anniversary, have I?" "It's a special day," Margaret answered meaningfully. "But don't worry. I just wanted to spend quiet time with you." Seated at the dining table, the two began conversation while drinking wine. Margaret consciously chose bright topics. Work talk, weekend plans, a friend's wedding next month. David gradually relaxed and began showing his usual demeanor. By the way, Margaret brought up casually, I heard from Emily today. David's hand stopped for a moment. The motion of bringing the wine glass to his mouth stiffened slightly. From Emily? Did she need something? Yes. Actually, she gave birth. Margaret carefully observed her husband's expression. David was clearly shaken. His complexion changed, and the hand placing the wine glass was trembling. Birth? Emily? But she's single. That's right. I was surprised. She didn't even tell us. Margaret continued her act. I found out on Facebook. She posted photos from the hospital. David was clearly flustered. He tried to say something, but words didn't seem to come out. The baby was very cute, Margaret continued. Our parents were in the photo too, and everyone looked happy. But strangely, there was something familiar on the table in the hospital room. David's face had turned pale. Your car keys. The ones with the keychain I gave you. Silence dominated the room. David tried to open his mouth but couldn't say anything. Margaret continued to smile quietly. Could you explain? Why were your keys at my sister's birth scene? David held his head in his hands. Margaret, it's not what it looks like. It's a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Margaret's voice was cold as ice. What kind of misunderstanding? Please explain. We. David was at a loss for words. You what? Margaret stood up. While I was suffering through fertility treatments, were you having an affair with my sister? And you got her pregnant? David didn't answer anything. His silence told the whole story. When? Margaret asked. When did you start having a relationship with my sister? Margaret, listen to me. David finally opened his mouth. We didn't mean to hurt you. It's just. Just what? Your inability to get pregnant was making our relationship strange. Emily understood that and comforted me. And then she had a child in my place? Margaret's voice was quiet but filled with anger. David nodded. Our parents knew too. Everyone did it thinking of you. Thinking of me? Margaret let out a dry laugh. You deceived me, betrayed me, and that was for my sake? Margaret, forgive me. That's enough. Margaret raised her hand to stop him. I've heard enough. Dinner is over. Margaret began clearing the table. David continued sitting in a daze. Margaret, let's talk. There's nothing to discuss, Margaret answered without turning around. You've already made your decision. And now it's time for me to make mine. That night, David ended up sleeping on the living room sofa. Margaret was alone in the bedroom, making final preparations. She had already moved important documents and valuables to another location. She had separated bank accounts and finished consulting with a lawyer. At 2 a.m, when David's sleeping breath could be heard, Margaret quietly began to act. She took out a suitcase she had prepared beforehand and packed the minimum necessary clothing and personal items. She removed her wedding ring and placed it on the dresser. When all preparations were complete, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and wrote a note. David, congratulations on the birth of your child. Our married life ends here. A lawyer will contact you. All future procedures will be handled legally. I have preserved all evidence of how you, Emily, and our parents conspired to deceive me. Regarding compensation, I will demand an appropriate amount. Thank you for 7 years of hard work. Margaret. She placed the note in the center of the table and Margaret prepared to leave the house. Before opening the front door, she looked around the house once more. The house where she had spent 7 years. A place filled with many memories. However, those were now nothing more than false memories. Margaret quietly closed the door. Outside was wrapped in silence, with only the streetlights casting dim light. She got into her car and started the engine. Her destination was decided. She had reserved a hotel in the city. She planned to spend several days there and prepare for her new life. As she started driving, Margaret felt a strange sense of liberation. Rather than anger or sadness, a refreshing feeling occupied her heart. The true nature of the discomfort and loneliness she had felt for so long had become clear, and she had finally been able to take action. Arriving at the hotel room, Margaret sat on the bed and organized her future plans. Divorce procedures, compensation claims, securing new housing, and above all, the beginning of a new life. Everything was waiting. Around 5 in the morning, Margaret's cell phone rang. It was from David. He must have discovered the note. However, Margaret didn't answer the phone. There was nothing left to say to him. The morning after spending her first night at the hotel, Margaret visited the law office at exactly 9 o'clock. Johnson & Associates was a well-regarded divorce law firm in the city, and Margaret had done thorough research beforehand. "Mrs. Hamilton, we've been waiting for you," greeted the elderly male lawyer, Robert Johnson. "Actually, everything was planned," Margaret began in a calm voice. "I had suspicions 3 months ago and hired a private investigator to gather evidence." The file Margaret produced contained photos of David and Emily's secret hotel meetings, videos of the two together, receipts from Emily's pregnancy test purchases, and even records of their joint obstetric appointments. Quite an impressive collection of evidence, Attorney Johnson admired. But that's not all. Margaret dropped another bombshell. "I also discovered irregularities at my husband's company. He created fictitious projects and embezzled company funds. He used those funds to cover the costs of his secret meetings with Emily and her birth expenses." The investigation revealed that David had misappropriated approximately $100,000 over the past 2 years. Margaret had perfectly assembled evidence of this as well. "I also have evidence of my parents' complicity," Margaret continued. Messages recovered from my mother's cell phone contain content like, "Keep it secret from Margaret and support Emily's pregnancy." My father also clearly stated, "We'll use any means necessary to get a grandchild." A week later, Margaret's revenge began. First, evidence of the embezzlement was anonymously sent to David's company. He was immediately fired, and criminal charges were also being considered. His career in the IT industry came to a complete end. At the same time, an anonymous report was also made to the hospital where Emily worked. Her affair with a married man and the resulting pregnancy and birth were deemed violations of workplace ethics, and she received a severe reprimand from the head nurse. Furthermore, evidence provided by Margaret revealed that Emily had inappropriately used patients' personal information, and she was suspended from work. Sanctions against her parents were also thorough. Margaret sent letters to all relatives explaining the facts. The letters detailing the family-wide betrayal and deception shocked the relatives greatly. Robert and Carol were excluded from family gatherings and lost the human relationships they had built over many years. To betray their daughter and conspire out of desire for grandchildren. Emily too, having an affair with her sister's husband is unbelievable. David is the worst, but I can't believe family bonds were so fragile. The condemnation from relatives was merciless, and the Montgomery family members were completely isolated. Most effective was the claim for compensation. Margaret demanded $500,000 in total compensation for emotional distress from the affair, damages from family-wide deception, and economic losses from David's embezzlement. Because the evidence was perfect, the opposing side couldn't fight it and had to agree to pay the full amount. It was a brilliant strategy, Attorney Johnson told Margaret when the final settlement was reached. Such planned and effective revenge is rare. However, revenge was not the end point for Margaret. It was merely a waypoint to a new life. Using the funds obtained from compensation and property division, she established a new real estate company. This time, it was a business specializing in supporting single women and divorced women. 6 months later, a letter arrived for Margaret. It was from Emily. "Sister, we deeply apologize for the mistakes we made. But your revenge went too far. David lost his job, I lost mine too. Our parents have been cut off from relatives. The baby is innocent, but everyone is suffering. When Margaret finished reading the letter, she quietly tore it up. They still didn't understand the gravity of their actions. They were trying to gain sympathy by playing the victim. What true family meant, beings who face each other honestly without deceiving one another, Margaret had learned painfully. Even with blood relations, without trust and respect, they are not family. Margaret continued walking toward her new life. To overcome past pain and find true happiness.